She was my landlady, graceful yet quietly alone, and one night, in a whisper meant only for herself, she confessed, "It's been years." I never planned to answer the way I did, but those words changed everything between us. When I first stepped into the townhouse, I wasn't thinking about love, or even companionship. I was thinking about rent, about school, about how the place smelled faintly of old wood and lavender, as if someone had taken extra care to make it feel like a home rather than just a property. The floorboards creaked under my shoes, and the walls carried the faint warmth of late afternoon light spilling through tall windows. It felt lived in. It felt safe. She appeared at the top of the stairs before I even had a chance to call out. My landlady. She was older than me, graceful in a way I couldn't quite describe. Not the kind of beauty that tried to impress, but the kind that lingered quietly, like a song you realize you've been humming all day. Her hair was tied back loosely, a few strands framing her face, and her smile, though polite, carried a kind of practiced restraint. "Welcome," she said, her voice calm, steady, the kind of tone that suggested she had done this before, greeted strangers, shown them around, set boundaries. Yet something about her eyes didn't match the professionalism. They were watchful, yes, but also tired in a tender sort of way. As if they had seen joy once, and had been waiting a long time to see it again. She walked me through the house, her heels tapping softly against the wood. I followed, noticing little things she probably thought no one cared about, the stack of well-worn books on the coffee table, the faint trace of chamomile from a half-finished cup of tea, the picture frame turned slightly toward the wall as though she didn't want it noticed. These weren't just details of a rental house. They were pieces of her life, hints of someone who lived not just with order, but with a history she kept tucked away. I nodded at her explanations, half listening, half distracted by the quiet elegance of her presence. She carried herself with confidence, yes, but it wasn't the kind that asked to be admired. It was the kind that came from years of standing alone, of learning how to depend on no one but herself. And yet, when she thought I wasn't looking, her expression softened, just for a heartbeat. A small, almost invisible sigh slipped past her lips. Loneliness, I realized, leaves its mark even on the strongest people. That was my first impression of her. My landlady. My neighbor under the same roof. I didn't know it then, but that afternoon would be the quiet beginning of something neither of us had been expecting. It didn't take long before I began to notice the small rituals of the house. She liked the evenings quiet. A single lamp by the kitchen window, the faint hiss of the kettle, the gentle clink of a teacup being set down on its saucer. I often found myself wandering into the kitchen at the same time, sometimes out of genuine hunger, other times because I caught myself waiting to hear her footsteps first. We spoke in fragments at first. Questions about my classes, her polite reminders about recycling bins, the weather. But little by little, the words stretched further. I found out she loved novels, the kind with characters that took their time to fall in love, where silence meant as much as dialogue. I admitted I usually read non-fiction, and she teased me with a quiet laugh, saying I was missing out on the better half of life. One evening, I was reaching for a pan in the cupboard when I saw her on tiptoe, straining for a jar on the top shelf. Without thinking, I stepped closer and lifted it down for her. Our hands touched for a second, barely a brush, but it startled both of us more than it should have. Her skin was warm, and I felt the faintest tremor in her fingers before she quickly withdrew, murmuring a thank you as though she'd broken some unspoken rule. After that, I started noticing the pauses. The way her gaze lingered just a moment too long when she thought I wasn't looking. The way she sometimes hesitated before leaving the room, as though weighing whether to stay. There was one night I remember clearly. I was making a late dinner, the scent of garlic and olive oil filling the kitchen, and she drifted in with her teacup, sitting quietly at the table. She didn't say much, just watched, listening to the sound of the pan sizzling. But her presence filled the room in a way that felt more intimate than words could. She laughed at one of my clumsy jokes, and the sound startled me with how unguarded it was, soft, melodic, like something she hadn't let herself share in a long time. For a moment, her shoulders relaxed, the lines around her eyes eased, and I saw a version of her that wasn't just the landlady. She was simply a woman enjoying company. Those evenings blurred together, strung like pearls on a thread, ordinary moments, yet each one carried a quiet weight. We were still strangers, technically. Yet, sitting there in the half-light of the kitchen, it began to feel like we were building something neither of us had planned for, companionship. It was a storm that brought us closer. The rain began in the late evening, a soft patter against the windows that grew into a relentless drumming. Thunder rolled somewhere in the distance, deep and steady, shaking the silence of the house. I was in the living room with a book when I heard her footsteps, slow, almost reluctant, on the stairs. She appeared in the doorway with a thin cardigan pulled tight around her shoulders, her hair loose now, falling in soft waves. She gave me a small smile, the kind that asked for permission more than anything else. "Mind if I sit?" she asked. I gestured to the armchair, but she shook her head and lowered herself onto the couch instead, keeping just enough distance to remain proper. Still, the nearness felt different tonight. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The storm outside filled the silence. I could hear the faint tremor of her breath, the way her fingers tapped against her teacup. Finally, she said, almost to herself, "I don't sleep well when it storms." Her voice carried something raw, like she'd peeled back a layer she usually kept hidden. I turned slightly toward her, waiting. She didn't look at me, just at the window streaked with water. "Years ago, storms were different," she continued. "They used to mean company. Someone beside me. Someone who made them feel less loud." Her voice faltered, then steadied. "But it's been a long time since then." There it was. Vulnerability. Not a confession meant to invite sympathy, but an honest truth that hung between us like fragile glass. I felt a weight in my chest, not pity, but a quiet ache for her solitude. I wanted to say something, to ease the heaviness, but words felt clumsy. So instead, I shifted slightly closer, enough that our knees almost touched. I let the silence stretch, letting her know she wasn't speaking into emptiness. Her hands twisted lightly in her lap, betraying nerve she didn't show in her face. And then, for just a moment, her eyes flicked to mine. There was a glimmer there, not just sadness, but the faintest hope, as if she was surprised by her own openness. "I'm here," I said softly. "Nothing more. Just that." Her shoulders eased, her fingers finally stilling. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. That night, we didn't talk about storms again. But something had shifted, something small, maybe invisible to anyone else. Trust had begun to bloom in the quiet between thunder and silence. The days after the storm carried a new kind of ease between us. Our conversations stretched a little longer, our silences felt a little less heavy. Yet beneath it all, there was something I couldn't name, a quiet tension that lingered in every pause, every glance we shared before looking away. It was a Thursday evening when it happened. The house was still, the kind of stillness that comes when night has settled fully, when the rest of the world seems far away. I had finished dinner, and she wandered into the living room with her tea, as she often did. But instead of sitting in her armchair, she settled on the couch beside me. Not close enough to touch, but closer than usual. We spoke in soft tones about nothing in particular, the book she was rereading, the way the garden would need tending soon. But slowly, the conversation trailed off. The space between us grew louder than words. I could feel her presence, her warmth, the subtle scent of lavender clinging to her skin, the delicate shift of the cushion as she leaned just slightly in my direction. My heart thudded, but I forced myself to stay calm, not wanting to break the fragile quiet. And then, almost too softly to hear, she whispered, "It's been years." At first, I thought I had imagined it. The words were barely there, carried more on breath than voice. She wasn't looking at me, her eyes were lowered, her hand cradling the rim of her cup like it was something to hold her steady. But her voice trembled with something raw, confession, longing, maybe even fear. The weight of those words settled heavily between us. I didn't rush to fill the silence, I let them rest, let her vulnerability breathe. My chest tightened with the realization of what she had shared, not just time past, but all that had been missing in those years. I noticed her hand, resting on the couch between us, fingers curling as if uncertain whether to reach or retreat. The air was charged, fragile, as though one wrong move could shatter the moment. I turned slightly toward her, my voice low but steady. "What do you mean?" She hesitated, her lips parting as if to explain, but no words followed. Instead, she closed her eyes for a second, shaking her head lightly, almost embarrassed by what had slipped out. But she didn't take it back. Her whisper hung in the room like a secret only I was meant to hear. And in that quiet, I knew everything between us had just changed. Her words still lingered in the air, soft and trembling. "It's been years." I sat there, caught between silence and the weight of what she had just revealed. She didn't look at me, not fully. Her eyes stayed fixed on the teacup in her hands, as though it might shield her from the vulnerability she had just let slip. A faint blush colored her cheeks, though she kept her expression carefully composed, as if regretting how much she had shown. I felt a pull in my chest, part ache, part tenderness. She wasn't simply talking about storms or loneliness anymore. She was speaking of something deeper, something that had been absent from her life for longer than she wanted to admit. And I knew if I looked away now, if I pretended not to understand, the fragile bridge she had built in that whisper would collapse. So I didn't rush. I let the silence breathe, let her feel that I wasn't uncomfortable with it. I shifted slightly, angling myself toward her. My eyes searched her face, and when she finally risked a glance at me, our gazes locked. There was hesitation in hers, but also a flicker of longing, unspoken yet unmistakable. And in that moment, I leaned closer, not touching her, but letting my voice soften until it felt like it belonged only to her. "Then let me be the first again." The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They were steady, deliberate, a promise, not a plea. Her breath caught, the tiniest sound escaping her lips. She blinked, as if trying to decide whether she had heard me correctly. Then her gaze dropped, her lashes lowering to hide the storm of emotion that had risen in her eyes. Her hand twitched against the couch cushion, fingers curling slightly as if they wanted to move toward mine but weren't sure they had the right. I didn't force it. Instead, I let my own hand rest nearby, open, patient, waiting. The air between us grew electric, charged with everything neither of us had said aloud. She pressed her lips together, then let out a quiet, shaky laugh, half disbelieving, half nervous. "You don't know what you're offering," she murmured, her voice faint but tinged with something vulnerable, something that almost sounded like hope. "Maybe not," I admitted softly, "but I know what I feel right now." And I kept my hand steady between us, close enough that if she wanted to reach, she could. She didn't take it yet. But she didn't move away either. And in that delicate stillness, something new began. The silence stretched after my words, but it wasn't empty. It pulsed with unspoken questions, with the weight of her uncertainty and the quiet steadiness of my promise. She sat so still beside me, as if any movement might break the fragile thread holding us together. Then, almost imperceptibly, she shifted closer. Not enough to be bold, just enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her body. My heart beat faster, though I forced myself to stay calm, to give her space to decide. Her shoulder brushed against my arm. Light, tentative, but real. I didn't move away. I couldn't. The contact was small, yet it felt as though the entire world had narrowed down to that single point of touch. She let out a quiet breath, as though testing how it felt to lean on someone again. Slowly, cautiously, her head came to rest against my chest. I froze, not out of fear, but awe. The weight of her cheek against me, the faint pressure of her body leaning into mine, it was gentle, but it carried years of withheld trust. I could feel the rhythm of her breathing, at first uneven, then gradually settling as if my presence was calming her. My arms remained still at my sides for a moment, until instinct and sincerity overpowered hesitation. I lifted one hand and placed it lightly over hers where it rested on her lap. Our fingers brushed. She stiffened at first, her hand twitching as though unsure. But then, slowly, she turned her palm upward and intertwined her fingers with mine. Her touch was tentative, almost fragile, yet the way she held on carried more meaning than words ever could. I felt the delicate ridges of her knuckles beneath my thumb as I traced them absent-mindedly, and the smallest shiver ran through her body. Not fear, something else. Something that told me she wasn't used to being held this way anymore, and yet, she wanted it. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to. The storm of tension that had lingered for weeks was quiet now, replaced by the simple, grounding truth of closeness. She tilted her head just slightly, enough that her hair brushed against my chin. I closed my eyes for a moment, breathing her in, the faint lavender, the warmth of her skin, the subtle steadiness of her heartbeat syncing with mine. It wasn't grand. It wasn't dramatic. It was something far better. It was belonging. The storm outside had softened into a drizzle, faint raindrops tapping gently against the glass. The house, once filled with thunder and silence, now felt wrapped in a different kind of stillness. Not empty, but full of the quiet understanding that something had shifted between us. She hadn't moved from where she rested, her head against my chest, our hands still woven together. Every so often, her thumb brushed faintly across mine, as though testing the reality of what she was allowing herself to feel. I didn't speak. I didn't want to break the spell of the moment. Finally, she stirred, pulling back just enough to look at me. Her eyes were softer than I'd ever seen them, though there was still caution there, still the instinct to protect herself. She gave a small, almost wistful smile and whispered, "You don't know what you're getting into." Her voice carried both warning and vulnerability, as if she was preparing me to step away before it went any further. But I only smiled, gently tightening my hold on her hand. "Maybe not," I said quietly, "but I know what I've found." She searched my face then, as though looking for any trace of doubt. Whatever she saw must have eased her, because her shoulders softened, and for the first time since I'd met her, she didn't seem to be bracing herself against the world. The room felt warmer, fuller. We sat there together, close, the sound of rain filling the spaces our words didn't need to. There was no urgency, no rush toward declarations or promises. Just the simple truth of presence, two people who had stumbled into each other's lives and decided, quietly, to stay. When she finally leaned forward, pressing a soft kiss to my cheek, it wasn't grand or dramatic. It was gentle, almost tentative, but it lingered. My skin tingled where her lips had touched, and I felt something inside me anchor deeper, certain. I turned slightly, just enough to meet her eyes again. Neither of us said anything more. We didn't need to. That night ended not with fireworks, but with a quiet, undeniable promise. She was no longer just my landlady, and I was no longer just her tenant. We were something new, something fragile, perhaps, but real. As I held her hand in the stillness of that room, I knew this wasn't the end of a story. It was the beginning of one. If this story touched you, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. And if you'd like more slow burn romances like this, make sure to subscribe, so you don't miss the next chapter of love, whispered softly, just like this one.